Welcome to Sounding Freedom and Liberation, a podcast series looking at the power of music and sound to engage with ideas of freedom and liberation. I'm Ferdia Stone-Davis.
And I'm Sharissa Granger. Today, we welcome our guest, Francio Guadeloupe, who is Professor by Special Appointment of Public Anthropology of Kingdom Relations at the Faculty of Social and Behavioral Science. This chair, recently taken up by Professor Guadeloupe, is positioned in partnership between the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Royal Netherlands Institute of Southeast Asian and Caribbean Studies, and the University of Amsterdam. He has an extensive academic background with a focus on Dutch Caribbean and the Netherlands Antilles, and his research concentrates on themes such as identity, post-colonialism, and social dynamics within kingdom relations. Professor Guadeloupe's principal areas of research have been on the manner in which popular understandings of national belonging, cultural diversity, religious identity, and mass media constructions of truth continue to be impacted by colonial racisms and global capital. He is currently the program chair of the NWO funded research programs Islanders at the helm, co-creating research on sustainable and inclusive solutions for social adaptation to climate challenges in the Dutch Caribbean. Guadeloupe also co-chairs the NWA-funded research program, Representing Europe, Popular Representations of Diversity and Belonging in the Netherlands. He is author of Chanting Down the New Jerusalem, Calypso, Christianity, and Capitalism in the Caribbean, and Black Man in the Netherlands, and Afro-Attalian Anthropology. Professor Guadeloupe, welcome. It is a pleasure and treat to be in conversation with you. We'd like to invite you to share, firstly, on what freedom means to you and how you practice freedom on a daily basis.
That's a good one. Good afternoon to both of you. I think that if I hear this introduction, I think I'm unfree after all of that that you said that I've done. So the topic today is freedom, as I understand it. To tell you the truth, if you put an adjective in front of it, then I know what we're talking about. But if you just say freedom, I think that's just what we are. That's where I start from, that I am able to act within constraints that are there or not, or within the choices that are there. So that's how I think about it. If you talk about political freedom, then that's something else. Then that is a historical struggle of most of the globe after the 1400s, 1492, that they've been struggling to actually create a different type of globe. Then we're talking about political freedom. And some of the things that they did, like nation states, I think was a mistake, because now people are struggling to try to undo the difficulties with nation states again. So I guess the question is, what kind of freedom are we talking about? That's the question. What is the adjective in front of it so we can talk about it?
Thank you so much. Well, then maybe, I mean, if we're talking about it then on a daily basis, this idea of freedom, can you say something about the different kind of freedoms that are at play in terms of your daily life? And I don't know if you think about them necessarily, whether it's a conscious thing or it's just something that we necessarily, by virtue of being human, it's just something we do.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I spent half of my life, or less than half, in the Dutch West Indies. And growing up, I can remember an important moment was I was in a carnival. Now there's carnival happening in Trinidad and these other islands, but it was an important moment in carnival, and there was the Respect Band, a band from St. Martin, and they had a song called Freedom. And what they were saying was, free up yourself, freedom, freedom. And we were just singing. I was a child, I was singing along, ecstatic out with this thing called freedom. I was not aware that much of the lyrics were about freedom in relation to slavery or so. It was just at that moment in time, the beat the melody, the intonation, and all of us having a kind of collective effervescence, collective moment of freedom. That's really what it meant. So to me, what I learned later on thinking about it was that, hey, freedom is a practice. It is something that you do. And you simply do it because you can't do otherwise. The opposite to freedom would be probably death, and you're not having a possibility of acting. So, and if I think aloud, this is about music. I think lots of Caribbean music has been about freedom or trying to create freedom, trying to create moments of freedom. And I think music creates moments of freedom, which is different than the everyday freedom of having to work and having to go there. I think music speaks about an aesthetic freedom. Again, putting an adjective in front of it. Music is about an aesthetic kind of freedom. And aesthetics to me belongs nowhere. It can't be placed in the existing everyday. It can happen during Carnival, but when it happens during Carnival or a jump up, you are not anymore in that space. You've just moved into another space. You've cut the regular time and you enter into a different kind of time. If you want, you can call it, it has a connection to the sacred time that some religious traditions speak about. So religious freedom is a different one again. So I think with music, you get the possibility of connecting to various types of freedom. The political freedom of emancipation, the let's say the spiritual and religious freedoms and the aesthetic freedoms, and you have all the other kinds of things because people use music for work songs to actually alleviate the work. So given that it is within the aesthetic, to me, that's what makes it a powerful mode of, and here I'm careful, mode of expression of we who human together with the rest of life that we are in a kind of concerto with.
Thank you. Thank you. And this is also, this is quite striking to me in terms of particular conceptions of the aesthetic, perhaps, which can be understood as something quite rarefied. You know, the aesthetic is something, somehow it detaches us from the everyday, especially within particular traditions, perhaps, where we enter into a special space to undergo a particular experience. But what you seem to be saying is that the aesthetic is this networked thing, this networked experience that connects us in many different ways to many different spheres, and then also perhaps then to many different kinds of freedom.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. So to me, it denaturalises the existent things, which we take as common sense. So we take work as being something which is separate, but the moment you add music to it is the moment that work becomes something else. At the moment you add music to it, then struggles for political freedom would necessarily have to entail a democratic element because it is the demos that sings and dances together. As when I was younger, I remember loving UB40, we will sing for our own, that song about apartheid. I remember looking at that in Aruba and seeing all those people dancing, and I thought, this is a political freedom, but it involves everyone. It involves the street cleaner, it involves the bum, it involves the activist. All of them are there singing that song, Aman Lawetu. It changed the notion of politics and the space that's supposed to be political, and you're only supposed to be a certain kind of actor to be in there. I think that's where music, again, denaturalizes that thing that people think is separate, and so forth. Music, I think, in certain, let's say, Latin and dancehall denaturalizes certain gender conventions again. Says, no, the erotic is not something masculine. The erotic is a particular kind of power now. Thinking about Audre Lorde or Charles Long, the theologian, that force which allows certain things to happen, which makes certain other things possible. So again, that's how I think the aesthetic and think music.
Great. It's somehow the words kind of space for emergence has just kind of appeared, which is, in my mind, maybe that's a kind of a useful thing. Since we're kind of thinking about part of this, the aim of this series is to kind of think about this language of freedom and music's capacity, what it can contribute. So maybe in terms of this aesthetic, this kind of space for emergence might be useful.
This is interesting because a lot of the times, at least in Caribbean studies, aesthetic is not thought of in those ways. And I think thinking about aesthetics in those ways makes a contribution to also how we think about ourselves and hence how we think about liberation. A lot of the times liberation is seen as resistance, but I think a more finer and more nuanced understanding, and as Fredia says, languaging might help us to get beyond thinking of liberation solely in terms of resistance, but towards, a process, as a process that takes one towards something else, right? Towards being more free. And I think, freedom and liberation is all often conflated as well. And I think your offering of aesthetics gives, a lot of food for thought in how we could, complicate it and think about it in different ways. Bringing aesthetics into that conversation, I think definitely there needs to be more work done on that. Yeah.
And
No, I mean, I go ahead, please.
Oh, it was just
Ferdia.
one thought.
Yeah, go ahead.
But it's this really, and I think, Francio, I think from what I've read of your work, you would agree with this. It's not this. It's this participatory aesthetic. It's this kind of. It's not something we passively encounter and experience. Not that one could ever really say we passively encounter these things, but actually we're really involved in the production of whatever it is that emerges. Sorry. Go on.
Yeah. No, this is true. I mean, so a lot of what passes, for co-creation, that already happens in musicality and in musicking. So I think, I run this program. I think one of the things is to recognize what is already there, because that's how people simply live with everything that's around them. So if I use the term hende, for me, a Papiamento term, hende to me is not only people who human. Hende is also the cats and the dogs and so forth. So I remember on St. Martin, I would call my dog Primo, and people would look up like, Primo, cousin? Because he was my cousin, in my opinion. So I think that, and of course, this is a contentious issue for many people who are struggling for the right to be human. So they're into humanism. I am not into humanism. Doesn't mean I'm into post-humanism or what is it, transhumanism or any of those other things. I just think that if you are truly into a kind of participatory aesthetics, then you recognize that it's not only bodies like us that are involved in it. There are many other things that are involved. Anytime you are in a Juve morning, one of these midnight before carnival, everyone is dancing, you recognize that the dogs are there too. The cats are looking on. You have all kinds of birds and they're all there. So I think you abstract it when you only speak about bodies that human in that sense. I don't think that works. I think that there is some of Caribbean studies that is, well, let's say some of those persons who study the Caribbean or study the world through the Caribbean, like Patrick Chamoiseau. I read his book now almost religiously. And what he's doing is he's saying the liberation of the humans that were enslaved has to go together with the liberation of those other chattels that were also captured, enslaved, and so forth. I think that there's where that participatory ethics, that's what it's about.
I mean, I think this ties in to your idea of the I and I, which comes out in a lot of your work. And it seems to be central to how you are moving to dismantle these kinds of categories that we find ourselves enshrined in, um, race, identity, gender, and the process that you go about to disentangle, dare I say, to decolonize. And I wondered if you could, share some more about I&I as a concept in relation to what you were just saying, in terms of, if we are to think about, the liberation of those who are unfree, it must be in a constellation of all beings who are in relation to us, also being free. So that I&I concept comes in nicely to disentangle that, I think.
Yeah, for sure. It's all that's co-appearing, because life is a co-appearance of all kinds of things. So I&I is a Rastafari term, I think, in the mystical vein of Rastafari, which Bunny Wailer pushed a lot, where he said in the beginning there was only one concept, I and I and I and I and I and I. And he says, then arose Apollyon, and you got you and I. And from that moment, there's trouble in the world, and the world is in trouble. So then you get war. So he's speaking about you cannot be without the other. It's a radical relationality, but it is a radical relationality which does not stop by those who human. That I and I and I and I contains all, therefore, the Rastafari notion of veganism. We are not just going to kill our other brothers and sisters that manifest differently, that we are also dependent on. So I think the I and I is that radical relationality. Let's say in Haitian Creole, you have the term neg, which was to the N word, which is negative, but in Haitian Creole, it simply means we are human. That's why they have to say neg marron when they mean a brown-skinned person, and neg blanc when they mean a lighter-skinned person. But neg is the term that they signify for all of us that human. In Papiamento, the language that we once in a while speak, it is always gente mujer. So you have to make clear what you're speaking about. Gente mujer, so a gente, a people, person, woman. Gente, hombre. So you constantly, so which means they're trying to speak about a relational, which then is dealing with manifestations, but the manifestations are different, but they're never separate fully from the relational mix. I think that is something that some of the things that emerged in people trying to understand their situation and work on their situation within the West Indies. I think you have that across the globe. And if we start with how people are trying to understand their situation and trying to further relate and enhance their situation, then we might actually have let's say, tools to actually push certain political agendas that we might have. And we might also understand why people are still alive. Let's say, things are dread, but I'm still alive.
Because in terms of this I&I, we're talking about, well, you've spoken about it in terms of radical relationality. In chanting down the New Jerusalem, there's also, there seems to be a sense of, it's also not just the human, not just in a, let's call it a horizontal sense, but it's the kind of vertical, that kind of, it opens out in a transcendent way, let's say. Is that true to say?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true to say. That's for sure true to say. There is, if you start relationality, things are relating because they're co-appearing. There is something which co-appears as well, but is not visible. Co-appears as well. I think if you, chanting down in Jerusalem, I use a Durkheimian take on religion, but if you take, let's say, a take from George Simmel, he would say religion is always that which doesn't fit, but it's there. It can't be put into any kind of system or order. That's when you know the religious is there. Now, therefore, there is one particular relation, if you want to call it towards a transcendent, fine. If you want to call it towards an empty space, fine. But there is one, let's say, one it's not right to call it one component of the relation because a component already visualizes it, but there's something which also partakes in relationality. And therefore that, again, denaturalizes these positions that we think we have. That's why when I spoke about identity in Chanting Down the New Jerusalem, I spoke about a relation identity. I didn't speak about something. I said, it is that you take up a position to be able to act. And then you become that thing. But that's temporary in order to act. It's not that that is you.
So,
Yeah.
in terms of, so the I and I in itself, it seems to be an incredibly fruitful concept to be working with. Are there any limitations to it, do you think?
Good one. If there are limitations, I think the limitations are how people use it. It's the practice that they do with it. So if I meet some persons, let's say St. Eustatius, and I say, how's the eye? I didn't say, how are you? I said, how is the eye? So I'm reminding that person that it's not only you there, you are in a relation too with something which is not visible, but it's there too. How is the eye? How is your relation to that which is not manifest, but is there? Now, some people might not use it in that way. They might limit it to a kind of humanocentrism. That's a possibility too. And then one would critique it. If one wishes to, one would critique it from that perspective. Again, the I and I is constellational. So there's another term which goes with it, which is give thanks. You don't know who you're giving thanks to, and say give thanks. So you're giving thanks. I remember there was a small shop in Aruba called Bristol Shop, and there was a guy there. His name was Bilal, and you would come in and you wanted to buy something, and Bilal would say, "Give thanks." So you have to give thanks. Now you did not know who you're giving thanks to, but in the end, he meant you also have to give thanks to the air that's between us. You didn't make it. So it was a reminder of that connectivity. Now, as a child, I know I just thought this is crazy Rastaman. I don't have to say give thanks. But later on, I understood what he was getting at with the give thanks. So there are these different conceptions. How's the livity? Which is another conception again, not living, not your life, but livity. So which means there's always an active component in it. Now, all these things connect in ways, or they illuminate parts of it.
And how provocative is that? And simultaneously transformative. I mean, and to actually be employing that on a day-to-day basis is just, at least from this perspective, that is my perspective, it's quite, it's quite challenging to think about, but also incredible in a positive way, What you've been emphasizing is, of course, practice. It's the practice of it's humaning. It's the I and I. The only limitations are how we practice it. The I and I is fundamentally relational, incorporating absolutely everything. What do you think then about this language of the human? Is it serving us? Is there something that should be in its stead? How do you feel about that?
Look, if I think about how it emerged, let's say, in one particular way, if you just use the term human, it is, of course, a term of the Renaissance. That's really the notion of the human is a Renaissance concept and notion, whereby in that history, it is more of an emancipation of humans in relation to a transcendent God in that. Then there is a later moment when you have the North American struggle for political independence of the United States of America. We have Thomas Paine and all of this of a human which is supposed to be equal and made in the image and the likeness of God. So it's tying into a particular Christocentric and Jew-centric, because it's all the New Testament understanding of humans, humans as they would call it. Of course, almost all societies that we've met with creatures who appear as we appear have such a concept, have a concept like that. And then they simply mean the people. That's all they mean, we the people. That's all they mean. But, and this is the big but in it, many of those other societies are able to challenge it from time to time because they don't close it off so tightly. The way it was closed off more tightly in parts of Western Europe and then North America. It really closed it off, and then you had something like the human. And of course, then the struggle for those who said, but wait a minute, I too am in the likeness of this thing you're speaking to. They then said, I want my right to also be human. So there's where you get these different types of radical humanisms to try to correct that. So which means you get Aimé Césaire, where he's saying you need a humanism made to the measure of the world. You get in the UK Paul Gilroy promoting a planetary humanism and so forth, because he would say there is something specific to us. So I guess there's where that history comes in. In anthropology, because I do anthropology, in anthropology we make a distinction between the human and the anthropos. Certain anthropos call themselves human. Not all anthropos have the conception of the human. So there are some of us that appear walking upright, appear being linguistically conscious, but we don't call ourselves human. Only some of us call ourselves human. And we have to ask ourselves, in calling ourselves human and doing all the things we did based upon that, whether that was the right way to act and engage with the rest of what appears. And some people would say, the verdict is still out, they would say, well, we can still have a humanism that is inclusive and eco-friendly and so forth. And then there, let's say Charissa would be more, then there is perhaps me, who would say, why do we actually have to do that? Why don't we just do something else? And then the verdict is out about that too. So I think the verdict is always out. I loved my dog, which was called Champion in those days. I really loved him. And if you were to tell me, well, you have something with another person that is superior and more important than Champion, I would tell you you're crazy. I had a good relationship with Champion, and we were good, and he was my primo. That was what it was at that moment. And that means that you can start from those types of things. There are people who have in Suriname wonderful relationships with birds. Birds become their best friends. They buy gifts for these birds. They don't say, I'm human, and then that is an animal. They actually give their birds a name. They carry it all over. So they know about companion species long before Donna Haraway and all these other persons start speaking about it. They live it. That's the way they engage with these things. Some people in relation to their plants and their trees, that they have a very tight relationship with that. Don't touch their trees or you will have trouble with them. So I think even within, because there's no way you can dismiss any kind of tradition. So even within what is called the North Atlantic traditions, I think William James, with his notion of an extended self, was already getting out of it, because his self was not tied or bounded to a body. he said the self is anything that you have a deep relationship to. That's the self. And it doesn't have to be human beings, and it doesn't have to be only your body. So I think there is, in all these traditions, ways of getting out of it.
And
that's not humanism to me.
Right, and it's so hard, isn't it? Because even this idea of extended self, even if we modify, the category of human, we're still it still comes with all that baggage that it has accumulated.
Correct.
So whether we just jettison it, but then how does one formulate something that can replace? It's whether to push the boundaries, explode it from the inside, or just set it to the side and take a new path.
Yeah, and those are choices one makes. I mean, let's say not so much the political activist Rastafaris, but the mystical Rastafaris, they realize you have to develop a different language if you want to. So you have to language differently. In St. Croix, you had the group Midnight, and they said our music constantly needs to have that backbone beat of a human heart to constantly connect. But that means that they were thinking the thing differently, and they were developing a different language. So we would need to develop a different language and a different set of concepts if we are going to jettison this thing. And I think you can sit in your room and develop it, or you can engage with others and see how are they busy developing something, and then work with that, extend it, think about it, participate, critique, work, and come up with something else. People were living long before this term human emerged. They were doing their stuff. Why can't they do it after the term has been let go? Of course they can.
And returning this to music, then, in that sense of the way you've been eloquently kind of outlining, it's participatory. It is that communal exercise. It is extended in that it takes in everything within its space. It enacts the I and I. Would you say that music is? I'm always loath to use the word uniquely placed to, music is unique in that sense. But is it in this sense that music offers something incredibly valuable, do you think?
For sure, because I think what it does not, beats do not necessarily signify something, a reference that's out there. That's not necessarily what they are about. I think that, let's say, the mode of relationality that we have is one where ipsity comes in, where we have the sense that there's a distance between myself and that other. We have that sense just simply because we have the skin and so forth. So we think that. I think music as an aesthetic, it denaturalizes that. So it doesn't say, no, there's no ipsity. It says, why do you think there's ipsity? Are you feeling the feeling, baby? No, you're feeling the feeling. So that feeling is not, but it's touching you. So which means your ipsity, yes, in a philosophical anthropology class, it is true, it is unbridgeable. But at that moment, that's not the issue. So again, back to that aesthetic, which is participatory, but constantly denaturalized all these supposed givens, supposed borders.
Yeah, and I think, a lot of this is moving towards overcoming the entrenched sense of rootedness, roots, authenticity, natural truth, what is factual, rational knowledge, all that comes into question. And I wonder, because you also speak about conviviality when you're trying to disentangle and disrupt these kinds of, more sedimentary notions of being. And you offer conviviality in your second monograph, Black Man in the Netherlands. And I wondered if you could, expand on that. like how you encourage conviviality, how you arrived at it from, your surroundings, your everyday practices, especially in the Netherlands.
Mhm.
And in a sense, how you can see unity between different people happening on that level, including plant life, animal life, sea life, air,
Yeah, yeah,
thought.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's a good one. Look, in that book, Black Man in the Netherlands, which was a book that was an answer to people primarily from the United States that would ask me, so how does it feel to be a Black man in the Netherlands? Because that's the question you get when you go to a conference or so. They're interested in that. So I wrote a book to try to say, let's look at this thing called black before I can even answer you in that question. And let me try to explain to you how I grew up uh, in the Netherlands. And then it was trying to say that uh, the first chapter, it was okay. So if we want to talk about black, let's talk about how people of Moroccan descent are treated in the Netherlands. That's where that's where the book started. So which means I had a connection to them. And that connection happened because on the, let's say, the formal institutional, systemic level, they created these ethnicities. And then you had organizations for these different ethnicities, the multicultural management tool. So you have one for the Moroccans, one for the Dutch Antillians, one for Suriname. Now, I think Great Britain would have had it, and France had it, and Canada had it, and so forth. But outside of that, youngsters are growing up. You want to go and buy bread. Now, that bread tastes nice. It happens to be a man from Turkey who's selling the bread. He doesn't care who is actually buying his bread as long as you're buying the bread. So difference becomes normal for you and for them. That's what conviviality is. When difference is banal, it just is there. You go to the supermarket, you just pay. You go to a club, you just dance. It just becomes that's what it is in the neighborhood. You don't look up anymore uh, in terms of that difference. That is what I was trying to argue. I was just trying to say next to the talk of ethnic tensions, next to that, there is a different levity happening. And maybe if we wish to do anti-racist work, why don't we start from that levity that's already happening amongst youngsters, in that case, it was also amongst women, the feminist movements that were trying to work out and create some kind of unity. Let's look at that. And that's what I was trying to argue in relation to conviviality, to living together, convivir. And that doesn't mean you all become one in that at all, because I is not about one, but you create a positive relationality with one another. That's really what it is about. And then from there, you can sometimes create temporary unities to fight something if you want to. That's then a political grouping or a social movement. But you're creating it then out of an existent conviviality. Or you can say, I'm going to create it out of my social layer, and then there we're going to organize all these people of that social layer to fight for something. Then you're just doing the work of the state to me. But that's something you can do. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I wonder about this, and I might have a small question.
Uh-huh.
You are chair of a climate research group, and I
Mm-hmm.
wonder how this conversation ties into, the discussion, the multiple discussions that we are having on
Mm-hmm.
climate change, climate events, climate disruption, climate disaster, climate
Mm-hmm.
justice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
Because it seems like if once we recognize difference and it becomes mundane and it becomes banal, or
Mm-hmm.
we recognize it as such, how can we take that into thinking about our relationship with and ourselves as part of in climate? Because I know you don't like to make that distinction between, you know,
Yeah.
us in relation to climate. We
Yeah.
are climate.
Yeah.
So if you could just, tie those into climate research and what you see as, beneficial to that conversation.
Yeah. Good. Look, let me illustrate because I don't explicate well, but illustration I can do good. Good enough. When Hurricane Irma hit St. Martin, I was on St. Martin. So one day before the hurricane was coming, there were no more planes that you could leave. So a couple of weeks before, planes stopped. So everyone was there. You just bought your stuff. And then the evening before, I spent with some friends on the beach. We went swimming and so forth. We said, we don't know what tomorrow will bring. So let's actually enjoy it now. I went back home, and in the night, the hurricane came. It destroyed the house I was living in. If I thought concrete and so forth was strong enough, the hurricane said no. So it destroyed everything. I had to run with my wife and daughter back then to a kind of safe space, but that was also being flooded, so it would have probably fell and we would have died because we couldn't go out. But the water was coming down, and if that concrete slab had fell, we were gone. So at that moment in time, you're there. The next day we came out. I was speaking to some persons. There was a person there from Ukraine, and I didn't even think about Ukraine, but person there from Ukraine, and she actually almost flipped. She flipped because the nice green hills of St. Martin were suddenly darkened, dry, and it reminded her of war. At that moment in time, what is happening is that her reality, her, let's say, past realities, is tying to my reality as in the other's realities, and we're trying to make sense of what happened. So it's not only this moment, but we're also trying to show solidarity at that moment with things that happened elsewhere. We're trying to make sense of it. We are then driving around, and we might have some ways of getting along, but there are other people who don't have anything. We're meeting them as well. And all of us will then have to ask ourselves, okay, so how are we going to be now? Because money doesn't count at that moment in time. You can have, I don't know how much on your bank account. There's no money then. It's just you have to survive together. You have to be there with one another. So, which means at that moment in time, all those persons that were around, also, let's say, the grocer who happens to be from Canton, they're there, they can't leave either. There has to be certain rules. What I realized, one of the beautiful things was that one of the grocery stores, there were these young guys who stood guard. Because after a hurricane, you get anomie. There's no norms, and then people will try to loot and so forth. But these guys stood there and they guarded that shop. So when he came, his shop was good. And he realized, wait a minute, this is because of the way I engage already with them beforehand. But he also then had to engage with people that he didn't like. But we're all in this situation together. And I think together, it didn't last long, but let's say the first few weeks, there was really a sense of communitas, a commonness that was amazing and unbelievable. People would get water because everyone got 2 bottles of water. If there was a woman who had children and 2 bottles of water did not suffice, they would give it away to her. It was a moment that I thought, well, wait a minute, this is a beautiful something. And then it became, how are we going to create normalcy? And here's 2 things that mattered. One was music. The radio stations had to play the music that people were accustomed to. That gave them normalcy. So the radio programs acted as though nothing happened. Yes, outside it's all destroyed, but when you put on the radio, it's as though nothing happened. And Chinese food restaurants, because most of the working class eat Chinese food. Those 2 things had to be up and running. Now, if you can think climate from out of that, then you're not into the local nativist. You're thinking about, okay, so what is it that makes people connect and come together?
Thank you so much, Francio, for joining us today. You've given us valuable insights not only into how we might begin to conceive of freedom and liberation in the sense of becoming more free, but also in terms of music's capacity to resource us in doing so. Thank you again.